this video, I'm going to be drawing the electron configurations of a couple elements. You guys can follow along at home. All you need is a periodic table and a pencil or pen and some paper. In order to draw the electron configuration of an atom, you need to start by looking at the periodic table. The periodic table tells you the atomic number, or the number of protons in an atom. Because an atom is neutrally charged, you know that the atom has to have the same number of protons and electrons. Let's start with potassium. Potassium has an atomic number of 19. This means that potassium atoms have 19 protons and 19 electrons. Let's begin by giving potassium 2 electrons in its inner electron shell. The first electron shell of any atom can fit a maximum of 2 electrons. So once we've filled this first electron shell, we move on to the second one. This second electron shell can fit 8 electrons, so let's give potassium 8 electrons in the second electron shell. Now we've filled the second shell because this shell can only fit a maximum of 8 electrons, but we still have 9 more electrons that need to go somewhere for the potassium atom. So let's put them into the third electron shell. Now we can fit 8 electrons into the third shell, but then this shell becomes full as well, so we have to place the last electron in the fourth electron shell. So potassium is going to have 1 electron in its outer shell. One thing you might notice here is that potassium is in group 1 in the periodic table, and it also has 1 outer shell electron. Let's move on to beryllium. Beryllium has an atomic number of 4, which means that beryllium has 4 protons and 4 electrons. So we put 2 of these electrons in the inner electron shell, but then this shell is full, so we have to move up to the next electron shell. The remaining 2 electrons go into the second electron shell, which means that beryllium has 2 electrons in its outer electron shell. You might notice a pattern here because beryllium is in group 2 in the periodic table and it has 2 outer shell electrons. Let's move on to aluminium. So aluminium has 13 electrons. When we put these into the electron shells, we again put 2 in the first electron shell. Once this shell is full, we move on to the next electron shell and we put 8 into the second one. And now the second electron shell is also full, so we put the last 3 electrons in the outer electron shell. Again, you might notice that aluminium is in group 3 of the periodic table and has 3 outer shell electrons. Next up, moving on to group 4. So let's do silicon. So silicon has 14 electrons, so again we're going to put 2 in the inner shell. We've now filled the first electron shell, so the next 8 electrons go into the second electron shell. And now this one is full, so we put the last 4 electrons into the outer electron shell. Again, here we see that silicon is in group 4 of the periodic table and it has 4 outer shell electrons, so there's a definite pattern here. Let's do nitrogen next. So nitrogen has 7 electrons, so 2 of them go into the inner shell, and the remaining 5 go into the outer electron shell, giving nitrogen 5 outer shell electrons, and nitrogen is in group 5. Moving on to sulfur. Sulfur has 16 electrons. So again, we're going to put 2 into the first electron shell, 8 in the second electron shell, and there are 6 electrons left, so those ones go into the outer shell. And again, sulfur is in group 6 and has 6 outer shell electrons. Next up is fluorine. So fluorine has 9 electrons, and again, we're going to put 2 into the inner electron shell, which means that there's going to be 7 in the second electron shell, or the outer electron shell. And again, you might notice that fluorine is in group 7, and it has 7 outer shell electrons. The last element we're going to be looking at is argon. Argon has an atomic number of 18. This means that argon has 18 protons and 18 electrons. When we draw argon's electron shells, we start with 2 electrons in the innermost electron shell, and now this one is full, so we move up to the next one. We put 8 electrons in the second electron shell, and now the second electron shell is full, so we move up to the third electron shell and put the last 8 electrons here. Argon, like all of the other elements in group 0, has a full outer shell of electrons. The main thing that you need to remember when you're drawing the electron structure for atoms is that each electron shell has a specific number of electrons that it can fit, and once this shell is full, you move up to the next one. So the maximum number of electrons that can fit into the first electron shell is 2, the second one is 8, and the third one is also 8. And you fill these electron shells in order. So you start by filling up the first one. And once this is full, you move up to the second electron shell. And when you can't fit any more electrons into the second electron shell, you move to the third one, and so on. The second thing that you might have noticed in this video is that there's actually a connection between the group number that an element is in and the number of outer shell electrons that it has. So group 1 elements will have 1 outer shell electron, group 2 will have 2 outer shell electrons, group 3 will have 3, group 4 will have 4, and so on until group 0, which will have a full outer shell of electrons. Thank you all for watching this video on how to draw electron configurations.